T. Higgins is the wide receiver 28, while Brandon Aiyuk is a wide receiver 13 in average draft position for the 2024 fantasy drafts. We discuss why their prices should actually be swapped, plus other wide receiver rankings we disagree with on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am one of your hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, but I'm not doing this. I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other host, Vinnie Iyer, and I'm not doing this. I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com. Right now, focusing a lot on the draft, free agency, all that good stuff, and looking forward to talking about the rankings today.
Yes, absolutely. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Vinny, you and I both went through the consensus rankings for wide receivers. And we went through the other positions, but we'll save those for the rest of this week. So today we're going to start with the wide receiver rankings. And a lot of these rankings right now, I am not agreeing with. Now, we are in April. Things will change, and some of the dynasty drafting might be skewing this data, but I did try to just look at redraft, mock drafts, and stuff like that. But I want to go through the biggest differences that we found throughout these consensus rankings. So right off the top here, Vinny, what's the most egregious difference that you saw among wide receiver rankings as we sit here on April 9th?
Yeah, and some of this comes with the uncertainty, and a couple uncertain aspects of this are related to the draft. One is what wide receivers are yet to come on teams to change the perspective of their pecking order, and then the quarterbacks that are going to be drafted by these teams to make us think one way or another, maybe point an arrow upward or downward based on that quarterback drafting for these wide receivers. Now, my guy that I think is being seen as just not that interesting, but I think he is Terry McLaurin. He's at wide receiver 32 right now. Cliff Kingsbury has come out and said, we got to make better use of our wide receivers. I don't think that's just coach speak. That's pretty obvious. They didn't take advantage of having Terry McLaurin and having Jahan Dotson on the outside. These are two pretty good receivers. Zach Ertz, we'll see what he has left in the tank. They do have Austin Eckler, but this is a team that wants to push the ball downfield better, get the ball in the hands of the wide receivers. And I think they were tempted a little bit to maybe put McLaurin on the trading block. They didn't do that. I mean, he's a veteran receiver that you want to attach with a young quarterback who can get open, run routes. And the biggest thing that's held McLaurin down is he's had the quarterback issues, but also he's not a big touchdown scorer. So that's always kept him from really living up to his potential. But in terms of a reality wide receiver, he's one of the best in the league. He can run all the routes all over the field. He's pretty reliable with his hands, has underrated speed. I think this guy's been a little bit untapped here. So you look at Cliff Kingsbury going back to Arizona, you had the big year from DeAndre Hopkins working with Kyler Murray. So if there's one guy that the young quarterback is going to trust and going to pepper that guy with targets, you're going to see that. And keep in mind, Dotson is still pretty young. He didn't really get to do a lot last year. So he's still learning and getting better. Well, McLaurin is pretty smooth. He's a guy that can go on the field. I think there's a little bit of Hopkins in him, and I think you'll see that kind of materialize here for Cliff Kingsbury. So I do like it. Whether it's Drake May or Jaden Daniels, I think McLaurin is going to be a very key target all over the field because, again, Dotson's still learning. Ertz, I don't know what he's got left. I mean, you get some checkdowns and all that, but I think McLaurin is going to take advantage of that. He's been waiting for a better quarterback situation here, and it's going to finally come. I think you can't say Sam Howell is necessarily the best to really unlock him because he seemed to have more chemistry with Dotson as well. So keep that in mind. So now he gets a young quarterback who's probably going to lean on the most veteran target on this team, and that's McLaurin. So I think 32 is just too low. I think he's a good shot here to be a solid wide receiver 2, and that's the baseline. If he starts scoring touchdowns, then anything can happen here. But I do like Terry McLaurin a lot. I've liked him as a talent. He just needs some guy to help him boost, kind of like DJ Moore, and I think this can happen for him this year.
Yeah, my biggest worry with McLaurin and why I wouldn't probably have him ranked too much higher than this is the touchdowns, right? And he's struggled to score touchdowns his whole career, and I don't really think a rookie quarterback is going to change that. Almost always I mean, look at how good of a year CJ Stroud had last year, and we're all freaking out. He had 23 passing touchdowns, and that's a fine year for a rookie quarterback. That's like you can't really expect much more than that. So I don't really expect whatever this quarterback to come in to support Terry McLaurin with an increase and touchdowns. And he's going to get around his 1,100 yards. So I am okay with this ranking. I understand where you're coming from. He's extremely talented, but I'm not saying it's egregious to me, but I understand your viewpoint there. Mine is T. Higgins, a wide receiver 28. Now, last year at this time, I was saying he was going way, way too high. He was like wide receiver 12 last year. That was too high for me. But now we've swung the pendulum the opposite way. Wide receiver 28 is insane. Like, I know last year was a gross year by all means for him and for the Bengals offense. He was the wide receiver 51 overall, wide receiver 42 average in scoring full PPR per game. But the year before that, like that's what I'm looking at, right? I'm throwing out last year. Everybody was hurt. They barely played any games together, healthy, Higgins and Burrow. The year before that, he was a wide receiver 19, averaged 13.8 points per game. And I expect him to get back to that, right? I don't expect him to be injured all year long. And in the games he did play last year, over 30 snaps, which is far less than he normally plays. So I'm just doing a low percentage snaps here. But in the games he played 30 plus snaps in last year, there was 9 games. He averaged 14.1 points per game. That was more than what he did in 2022. Now, that gets him into the wide receiver 15 to 20 range. And that's exactly where I think he belongs. Do I think he's going to be a wide receiver, a top 12 wide receiver with Jamar Chase still there? That's going to be hard, but he should not be all the way down at wide receiver 28. He should be somewhere in that lower teens. And if he stays at this value, it's going to be a really, really nice undervalued guy here that you can snag in your drafts.
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit dependent on the draft that to see where the targets go. Right now, Trenton Irwin would be their next target with Tyler Boyd gone. We'll see if they do anything at tight end that moves the needle more than what they've already done with like their limited acquisitions here. So, yeah, I think the targets line up here with T. Higgins, and I think he's just always undervalued. And yeah, I think this is a ridiculous ranking for really both of these guys. I
Some of
mean,
these wide receivers they have ranked
yeah,
over him. Rashee Rice, I'd rather T. Higgins. He
no,
has the same upside. Deebo
yeah,
Samuel, I'd rather T. Higgins. Jalen Waddle, I'd rather T. Higgins. DK Metcalf, rather T. Higgins. Keenan
yeah.
Allen is still at wide receiver 25, much rather T. Higgins. And then even Devonta Smith sitting there at wide receiver 26. I think I'd rather Higgins. Both of these guys might be undervalued with Devonta Smith and T. Higgins, but it's just way too low. Like that's a steal for T. Higgins going
Yeah,
into next year.
Yeah, I think part of it is he is a guy that can score touchdowns. He's got a big body. He can stretch the field a little bit. And they've used him inside, much like Jamar Chase. They move him around the formation, so that could help as well. He could serve a little bit more of a big slot role with Tyler Boyd gone because Trent Irwin can play on the outside. So there are different ways to put him out there. But right now, the targets and the way things are going line up with him seeing a lot. I mean, McLaurin acting well as a number one, Higgins working well as a number two. So I think they're paths to both these guys finishing well above wide receiver 3 status and getting into wide receiver 2. So looking forward to that. And we'll talk about 4 more wide receivers. Our next segment will actually look at 2 guys that are a little too high for our sakes here. So we'll break them down. We've got 2 good choices for you, I think. So stay tuned. Then we'll look at some guys that maybe a little bit undervalued that we like a little bit later in rankings as well. All right, this episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is sponsored and brought to you by BetterHelp. And it's the time of year where we know April showers can come out there and it can be a little bit gloomy. Spring is here, but we're looking at maybe cloudy. Some places we had snow last week, and sometimes the weather can affect our mood and how we're feeling. And a lot of things can do that. Well, sometimes you need something to get you back on track. And talking it out often helps. So that's why I can't recommend therapy enough here. I've been seeing a therapist for quite a while now, and they just kind of put things in perspective. If things are looking cloudy and a little dark here, they'll help you find the light and just help you back to your normal self and finding out what's most important to you. And really, it's a great place to do that is online with BetterHelp, because if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule and needs. Just fill out a brief questionnaire. Then you'll get matched with a licensed therapist that you feel can fit with you. And if it's not the right fit, you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So you know that you're talking to the right person to help get you where you need to be. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockdown today to get 10% off your first month. It's a really good deal. Get in on that. Betterhelp.com/lockdown. Against BetterHelp. Help is HELP. Betterhelp.com/lockdown to take advantage of that offer and get in it with online therapy today. All right, Michelle, let's look at our wide receivers that we think are too high. And these are guys that are actually both in the top 15. So I'll let you reveal your guy first. And I 100% agree with yours, by the way. So it's going to be a lot of fun to break this guy down. I think he's going to be quite a polarizing pick this fantasy season.
It's Davante Adams, and I can't believe he's still this high. Wide receiver 10. He was almost my most egregious one. Like, I don't think it's that off from having T. Higgins where he is. He finishes a wide receiver 16 in fantasy points per game last year. And that was with 175 targets. That was the second most in the league, behind only CeeDee Lamb. Think about what CeeDee Lamb did last year in fantasy and what Davante Adams did. Completely different seasons. And also, Adams did score 8 touchdowns last year. So it's not like he only had a down year because he wasn't getting into the end zone. He still only finishes a wide receiver 16, getting all those targets and scoring 8 touchdowns. Also, while having 2 games with over 37 fantasy points. Like, this seems almost impossible that he ended this poorly. And I know you can't just take away his best games, but if you take away just those 2 games, he goes all the way from 15.6 points per game, which keeps him at wide receiver 16, all the way down to 12.4 points per game, which is pretty much useless in terms of, having a week to week fantasy relevance. And I don't see it getting any better this year. He's turning 32 years old this season. Who's their quarterback? Nobody knows. It could still be Aiden O'Connell. It could be a rookie quarterback. It could be Gardner Minshew, who they signed. I would say I would feel the best about Gardner Minshew. Like, I actually think Adams could have some really a solid enough fantasy season with Gardner Minshew. But is that really the quarterback that the Raiders want to go with when they're trying to rebuild here with at their quarterback? I just don't think this offense is going to be good at all. No running back, because they got rid of Josh Jacobs and didn't replace him. We'll see what Zamir White can do. I don't know how much scoring opportunities he'll have. It's still Davante Adams. He's going to have some good weeks. He'll probably still finish as a wide receiver 2 somewhere, wide receiver 18, 19, 20, kind of like he did last year, wide receiver 16 after some big games. But no way am I taking him over guys like Chris Olave, Drake London, Mike Evans, who have such a higher ceiling. Or even if you don't want to take the wide receivers going after him, he's going right around Kyron Williams and Jonathan Taylor and Sam Laporta and Josh Allen. Like, go a different position. I just can't imagine spending up this amount for Davante Adams. If you want a guy, old guy with high upside, just take Cooper Kupp 3 rounds later, or wait much later and take like a Mike Williams. I don't know. Davante Adams, wide receiver 10, is insane to me.
Yeah, I feel really bad for Davante Adams because he was promised one thing, or when he came over the trade, he was like, okay, I'm going to play with Derek Carr. Things are going to be great. It's going to be a nice transition from Aaron Rodgers. Well, that didn't happen for very long. And he had last year's quarterback mess with Jimmy Garoppolo adjusting him. By the time he got maybe used to him on the same page, he was not the quarterback. Then they break in Aiden O'Connell, and it got ugly there. There just wasn't a very good solution. Now, there's one glimmer of hope for Adams, but I think that maybe keeps him at the level he was last year versus having a big decline versus jumping all the way to wide receiver 10. That's Luke Getsy. They do have some history in Green Bay, so that kind of is good. But I think you're right. It really comes down to how much is Gardner Minshew going to pepper this guy. And keep in mind, Jacoby Myers was not nothing, right? He was still there and making some plays, and he's younger, and we know that. I think they'll try to include Michael Mayer a little bit more in what they're doing. They did say goodbye to Hunter Renfrow, so that helps a little bit here in terms of how the targets get spread out. I think it could go either way, but I just don't see the ceiling coming up to wide receiver 10. I just don't like it there. I think I feel comfortable if he's a middling wide receiver 2 in that range in the 15 to 20, right? Much more than this 10. I mean, I think 15 to 20 actually might be the ceiling for him at this point, given the age and all that and the nature of this Raiders offense. So you're right on there. And I agree with you. I think you'll agree on mine as well. Brandon Aiyuk, this is just way too high. Wide receiver 13. He finished really high last year. Why? Because he was averaging more than 17 yards a reception. That's not going to happen in back-to-back years. He was very big play dependent to put up his numbers. Now, his targets were rather modest, just a little bit over the century mark. So his targets were not big at all. And you had Deebo Samuel in the lineup, George Kittle. It was still there for a lot of downfield plays as well. So it's just going to be hard to duplicate that. You just cannot live on those long plays downfield. You have to be a little bit more consistent. He wasn't a big touchdown scorer either, in the 7 range. So I think you look at that and say, hey, is he going to really make these big plays? And get it, this offense sets him up for that with Brock Purdy and the way that Kittle and Samuel get attention and Christian McCaffrey setting things up. But again, there's a lot of mouths to feed here. It's really hard to expect all these numbers to kind of repeat themselves with San Francisco, and we'll see. I mean, Jawan Jennings might have a bigger role as well as we go forward. There's also a chance late, right, in this process that Brandon Aiyuk gets traded. There's still that out there. So there's no way he duplicates a wide receiver 1 ranking here. I think he was 9 or 10, depending on the format you're looking at. This is 13. You're just saying this is a slight drop off? I don't see that. I think you're looking at maybe – look, I actually think he's below Adams because he doesn't have the touchdowns and the targets to bail him out the way that Adams does, right? Adams is going to get a lot of targets. He's going to score a few more times, as given his history. So Aiyuk, if those big plays shrink, even if it's down to like 13 or 14 yards a catch, you're losing a lot of yards and points and catches there with that. And that can already slip you into that deep wide receiver 2 range.
Yeah, absolutely. Ayuk only had 104 targets last year. It seems impossible with him putting up 1,300 yards. But you brought up the efficiency. I think he goes back down to what he's been averaging in his career prior to this. And it was always good. 13 range, 14 range, 14 yards per reception is fantastic. 17.9 is absurd, right? Like that's going to be really hard to duplicate. We just saw this on this exact same team with a wide receiver a couple years ago. Deebo Samuel back in 2021 averaged over 18 yards per reception. That dropped dramatically the next season and went up a little bit more this next season. But like it still stayed well below 18 yards per reception. So even if he's at 14 next year, that's going to be fantastic for him. That's a great season, but that's going to kill his fantasy points if he sticks around 104 targets. And like you brought up, I don't know if I'm taking Adams over him. I probably am just going to stay away from both. But like T. Higgins is wide receiver 28 consensus. Well, Brandon Aiyuk is at wide receiver 13. I would have no issues taking T. Higgins over Brandon Aiyuk. I would rather him on my team because they'll probably, I mean, right now they typically have had the same amount of targets anyways, but you can see where T. Higgins could increase in targets, right? And he's going to be on this great offense along with Brandon Aiyuk. But at least in T. Higgins' shoes, it's Jamar Chase competing him for targets and really nobody else. Brandon Aiyuk is stuck on this team that in one game could just go all CMC, one game go all Deebo, next game could go George Kittle. He has so many, competitors on his team that can take stuff away from him. Now, if he gets traded, we can have another conversation. Then wide receiver 13, depending on where he goes, could be a very fair price. But right now, if he's staying with the 49ers, no, I would literally just swap out these consensus rankings and put Aiyuk at more towards wide receiver 28. Maybe that's a little too low. And T. Higgins, closer to the teens.
Yeah, it should be fun to watch how this 49ers perspective is. And you mentioned it with Deebo Samuel. It could easily swap back to him being the big play threat. Aiyuk becoming more of that intermediate threat. So you can easily flip back in this offense. I think, again, it's maybe opportunity and game based. So it's just very hard to duplicate. And I think that's the one knock I have with all these rankings so early. It's a lot mirroring what we had last year. It's not going to do that. Maybe that's something that will change as we go on throughout the offseason, but it's not going to end up like last year. Things are always different from the previous year. There's a few guys that have been consistent. Like that was Davante Adams early in his career when he was scoring double-digit touchdowns. The same thing with Aaron Rodgers. But if there are variables that change all around, it's going to change these guys. And I think that comes into play with these 4 receivers. And the next 2 we'll talk about in the final segment.
Oh yeah, and I love my one guy. And you chose what I was thinking of, but I didn't want to be a homer. I can't talk Steelers players every time, so I stayed away. But I'm happy you'll be talking about my boy George Pickens. We'll get into that right after the break. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Game Time app. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. I'll say my sister was in town this summer, and we saw some people walking around while we were at brunch wearing their Astros jersey. And I was like, oh, shoot, I want to go to an Astros game. I want to bring my sister to an Astros game. We just jumped on the Game Time app because I use them all the time. I knew we could see where our seats were going to be. We knew it was going to be super easy. And we had seats on our phone in like less than a minute. It was fantastic. And we went and had the best time of our lives watching the Astros crush up on all their competitors. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're set. Tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through your email. Take the guessing work out of buying tickets with Game Time. All you have to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Terms to apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So you disagree with George Pickens right now at consensus wide receiver 36. Are you saying that's too high or too low? And it better be the right way, or else I'm hanging up on this podcast.
It's too low, Michelle. Come on. I mean, he's
Yeah.
got Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. However it works out, I don't care. This is just great for him. There's no more Deontay Johnson. George Pickens, this is what he wanted, right? He wanted to be the alpha. There wasn't room for him and Deontay Johnson on this team. So he's a guy. And he's special. We know that. He's got some big playability. Remember that season, or I'd say off season he had, where it was all the hype. It's going to be Kenny Pickett to George Pickens. It's going to blow up the NFL. Well, I think Pickens was just waiting for Pickett. It never happened. Now Kenny's gone. He's on the other side of the state in Philadelphia. So he's going to look at it with Russell Wilson. What does Russell Wilson still have that's always going to keep him interesting on our radar? It's his big arm. He can throw downfield, hit anyone, anywhere. And look, Justin Fields is a pretty good thrower as well. So either scenario you're looking at, I mean, we know that Wilson is going to open the season as a starter. He's probably like the bridge guy in a weird sense here for the Steelers, and hoping that Fields develops. That's good because, again, Wilson likes these dudes, right? He likes the DK Metcalf type, has a big body. I mean, going back, you can look at Jermaine Kearse to a very limited sample size when they weren't throwing a lot in Seattle. He loved Jermaine Kearse because he could stretch the field and make some big plays for him. And in a smaller package, Tyler Lockett can do that for him as well. So when you look at it, George Pickens has some of those slot capacities as well as a big slot, so he can stretch the field on the inside. On the outside, Wilson will definitely push the ball to him quite a bit. I just expect the Steelers offense to be very limited in terms of how they spread it around, right? We saw it with the Falcons and Arthur Smith, much to our chagrin, that it was a lot of Drake London and not much of anyone else, which this could actually work in George Pickens' favor, right? If they're going to run the ball, have some more success with Najee Harris up front, set it up, create those big play shots for Wilson. And the other thing Wilson does, if he's getting pressured, he's going to move around, buy some time, wait till George Pickens gets open and gets him downfield. So I have not put any numbers behind this because it's hard to look at it, right? I mean, this is a completely different offense, different targets, no Johnson, no Pickett. So it's really hard to look at it that way, other than Steelers' offense is going to be much improved. They're going to throw the ball with the greater efficiency. Wilson is going to get the ball to him. And if that all happens, he's not going to be a wide receiver 3. And keep in mind, this guy shot up as a wide receiver 2 late last season when he had just a little bit of Mason Rudolph coming in there ahead of Mitchell Trubisky and Pickett. So sky's the limit, I think, for Pickens, and we're finally going to see it. I know Pickett to Pickens was fun to say, but I think Wilson to Pickens is going to be a lot more fun.
Oh yeah, Pickett to Pickens is supposed to be something, huh? Yeah, something terrible. But yeah, you can't. I don't know how you see Russell Wilson just thrive with Cortland Sutton type of play and DK Metcalf, like those type of players,
Yeah.
and not not bring that over for George Pickens, who plays a lot like them and makes insane plays with when given the chance. Like, he just needs a quarterback to throw it up to him, like Mason Rudolph was willing to do. Kenny
Yeah.
Pickett and Mitch Trubisky were too scared to do that, right? The biggest thing with Pickett is he was petrified of throwing interceptions because he started his career throwing a bunch of interceptions, and he was like, you know what? No matter what I do, it's not going to be an interception. It's not going to be a completion, but it won't be an interception. So now that he actually has a quarterback that will be willing to throw it up to him, it should be huge. And without Deontay there, he should easily get 130 targets next year. Even in an Arthur Smith heavy run offense, still should get around 130 targets. So I love that. Now, my guy, I am just going to have to keep hyping him up all off season. It's Mike Williams, wide receiver 53. He's now the wide receiver for the Jets after getting signed, so he gets to play with Aaron Rodgers. It's too low. And I'm not going to call it egregious because I understand why it's lower. He's had a very, very hard time staying on the field. So, yes, he's going to be lower in drafts, and that's why it's going to be great to draft him. If he was going high, I'd be scared too. But this is too low. This is going too far because when he is on the field, he produces a lot of fantasy points. Among wide receivers that have played 30 or more games over the last 3 seasons, Mike Williams has scored the 14th most fantasy points per game in that span, 14.8 points per game. That's more than Amari Cooper, more than DJ Moore, more than DK Metcalf, more than T. Higgins, way, way more than Brandon Aiyuk, Davante Smith, and Terry McLaurin, right? And this is over the last 3 years span. And I get we're worried about the injuries, but now he's playing with Aaron Rodgers. So he's playing with a guy who's going to throw it up to him. We know Aaron Rodgers is going to just chuck it up there. Mike Williams, it's not a 50-50 ball when it comes to him. It's more like 80-20. And it's what gets him hurt sometimes. But he scores points when he's on the field. And there's no way you can tell me that you'd rather take risks with guys like Christian Watson, who's going wide receiver 42. That dude's always hurt, and he has barely showed anything. I would much rather Mike Williams over Hollywood Brown. Cool, he's with Patrick Mahomes, but really, like, at least Mike Williams shows when he's on the field, he like is dominant. Jameson Williams is going over him. What? Romeo Dobbs is going over him? That makes no sense. Like, he should be going. I know he shouldn't be like a top 6 round pick because of the injury history, but wide receiver 53, that's just getting crazy low there on him.
Yeah, I just wonder if this ranking is based on maybe some information on the Jets going for a wide receiver, right, in the draft, and something you can definitely think about here. If the Jets go for a wide receiver, then this might be right, because it's going to be a high wide receiver. It's going to be Malik Neighbors or Romudunze, but I don't think either player is going to last to their pick. I'm just going to be honest with you, at number 10. So when you look at that, I mean, if he's the number 2 guy behind Garrett Wilson, he's going to get his targets downfield. And we know that's how Aaron Rodgers prefers it, right? He likes one guy who's reliable to run all the routes, the Davante Adams, and then he likes to mix it up with the guys downfield. But there's only one guy downfield right now, and Mike Williams. So, yeah, this is just really low. So maybe just waiting on what will happen in the draft, and maybe some skepticism as we had on the Eclipse episode about Aaron Rodgers and how much he can still have left, right? And if that doesn't trickle down, well, then Williams is not going to produce. And then Williams himself, I mean, you mentioned it, he gets hurt all the time. So, but again, we can't base a lot of what we're looking at on the guy's health. We have to go in. I mean, last year we were right on what Mike Williams is going to do. He just got hurt. I mean, that can happen to anybody. Mike Williams might be a little bit more injury prone than some other wide receivers, and his career kind of bears that out. But again, you're not taking a big shot on him, right? You just mentioned where he's wide receiver 53. If you take him at wide receiver 35, you can get that value. So some things you have to just think about. Okay, is this guy has some upside? Just check all the boxes. Okay, he's a number 2, is going to get favorable coverage. He's playing with Aaron Rodgers. That might be enough to say, I want to take a higher flyer on this guy than where he's at that position. So the situation, things you're looking at, maybe, again, this I think is tied to the Jets' skepticism and just potentially not knowing exactly what they're doing at wide receiver. So all that, I think, is come into play. And I think that's why it's fun to look at these rankings now, because they could change dramatically by the time we get into July and August, when a lot more things are in perspective when we know how these teams are throwing to players all around the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the best point there is, like, you're taking him at wide receiver 53. And even if you took him at wide receiver 45 or 40, like, you're still taking a guy that all he has to do, the only thing you need to hope for is health, and he's going to wildly pay off on your pick. These other guys that are going there, they need to be have as good of a performances as Mike Williams when they're on the field and then also stay healthy themselves. Like that's a double whammy. I'm just going to take the one where I only have to just have them stay healthy, not also get good at football, like some of these other guys. So that's why I just think he's too low. But that's it for today's show. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every day, Vinny and I will be back tomorrow talking running back rankings and what we agree with or what we don't agree with, actually, with either they're going too low or too high. It'll be a great conversation. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.